No, you look fantastic. You look fantastic.
Okay, great. So,
Cool. Okay, so Peter, you have written, I think, a book that is desperately needed for the current day because I think a lot of people have an abstract idea of what the top upper echelons of the global elites may be up to, but your book really provides color, clarity, and detail to that. So I'd like to thank you for that. And
thank you.
especially with the incoming climate catastrophe, we really do not have much time to fundamentally change the way that the world is being run. So, in your book, you identify that 17, I think 19 with your later editions, giants in big investment funds control 50 trillion, about half of the world's wealth. So in your book you say that it kind of expands further than that. How does it expand further than just the funding and the resources that they control within that bulk?
Well, 50 trillion is the largest consolidated concentration of money, capital. And I mean, so you have like Apple and Amazon are $1 trillion companies. But a major part of what that entails are patents, buildings, sales, stock. I mean, a variety of things that aren't cash, that aren't easily convertible. So we're talking here, when we say these investment giants, they're the ones like BlackRock that holds $6 trillion worth of investment capital. And their board of directors, and of the 17 giants, it's less than 200 people, are what we call the core of global capitalism, because they're managing and deciding how that capital is going to be spent, where it will be spent and invested. And they have multiple problems. The biggest problem is they have more capital. They've got good, safe places to put it. So governments accommodate them. Intelligence agencies support them with regime changes so there can be expanded capital investment in various parts of the world. Wars spend a lot of money, and these giants are invested in all the war companies, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, in very big ways. So permanent war, and then the buying up of public resources. So water rights and freeways and even universities are really up for sale and to be privatized. So the effort is to literally privatize the world, own everything, and the capitalist governments, the core governments, and their intelligence agencies and their military empire are working in support of that. So that's just the given core agenda. So manipulations in Venezuela or Cuba or Nicaragua or Iran, and or challenging the Chinese or the Russians in various capacities, are designed to protect that global capital and allow it to continue to grow and expand and concentrate.
Yeah, in your book on Russia, in your book you say that the capitalist class and the members of this transnational elites are salivating over the opportunity to kind of dispose of Putin and or the possibility that Putin maybe become no longer the leader of the country, and the fact that they would be able to invest and essentially privatize aspects of Russia, or as much of it as they can. What progress are they making now on doing this, and how does this aim intertwine with Donald Trump and his administration?
Trump, well, it's pretty clear that the Russians wanted Trump to win over Clinton, because she was very adamant vehemently opposed to Russia, wanted to see a regime change. She reflected the beliefs of the Atlantic Council, and both Democrats, Republicans, and Wall Street would like to have the opportunity to expand and grow. It's not that Trump is totally accommodating that, but he was less of a threat overtly than Hillary. Now, to what extent the Russians' involvement helped Trump win is still debatable. Even with the Mueller report, I mean, yeah, the Russians were offering dirt on Hillary, and people in his on his campaign committee were anxious to get some, and of course the Democrats were doing the same thing. So, but to the degree to which it was actually affected the election, it really is minor at best, and may have been focused in some states where Mercer and others bought access to voters directly online, and trying to persuade them based upon their core values and beliefs. And increasingly elections are managed that way, but both the big parties do that. Mm-hmm. So it's not like it was some catastrophic tragedy. Mm-hmm. What they failed to take into account for Hillary was the degree to which working middle class people are suffering in the U.S. and have been in decline, and the reaction. So, like the BritX vote was very similar to the vote in favor of Trump. People actually voting against their own best economic values, but voting because they're pissed off.
Exactly, it's a material response, right? Like you mentioned in the book, the counter-revolution that the establishment had under Thatcher, Reagan, where this all kind of began. You know, these people have been being pummeled, same across the world, the UK as well, for many years. So they were basically being like, F you to what was perceived as the establishment, we're going to vote for Trump, you know, and then they freaked out and were like, oh, it's Russia, it couldn't be our own failings, you know. So I think that's kind of what we saw with the Mueller report and the no evidence of collusion.
Right.
But so you say
but
that
Trump gave them everything they wanted.
When it comes to Russia, he's selling arms to Ukraine.
The Wall Street, what they wanted. The investment capital, what they wanted. The rules were reduced that Obama had put in place after 2008. So it's a wide open, program, and they're supporting their regime change policies around the world to try to expand and allow greater capital penetration everywhere. And they reduced their taxes and allowed them to repatriate billions at a lower tax rate. So they got everything they wanted from Trump. So private Social Security yet, what like Jamie Dimon is wanting them to do, but they'll get there, or they'll try to get there.
So on back to the kind of the global elite and their core, you say that they often know each other personally, and as an example of that, UK Prime Minister Theresa May's husband is a senior executive on Capital Group, which is one of these big funds. I was wondering maybe a bit more detail about how intertwined are these kind of elites that are more behind closed doors at the top of this global power structure. How far are they intertwined with the more visible ruling class, like say Theresa May, as we're talking Donald Trump, and etc. etc.
Well, it's totally interconnected. I mean, I use the analogy of like a redwood forest, where there's hundreds of trees and all their roots are interconnected. And it's a sociology of the forest more than the biggest tree that's there. In that case, maybe Bezos would be like the biggest tree, but he is just one person. There's a sociology here that has a core, and the core, the structural core that the agreement of how it's all interconnected is around money, around capital, and how it's invested. So people who are invested in the globalization of capital and capital investment worldwide have an interlocking agenda and self-interest to continue to see growth and expansion of that. So they go to Davos every year and celebrate each other in a very big way. They come to the Russian River in California at the Bohemian Grove. All the men do, and they celebrate themselves in a big way. And what we've seen in the last 30 years is this sort of financialization coming into place over manufacturing and producing things that capital is basically invested in financial growth and management. It'll invest in companies that are making things, but only in the sense that they can get a return and expand their wealth in a concentrated way. So that network of people, with the core being the 200 that are managing the capital, and then a couple hundred others that are part of these policy councils, like the Atlantic Council. But the Council of 30, based in Washington, D.C., is top bank heads of central banks and economists in the world, 32 of them. They're putting out policy reports that the transnational banks, the World Bank and the IMF, take as instructions. So, I mean, they're privately funded, and they make policy recommendations outside of government influence that government organizations, the transnational government organizations, follow and accept. The other big one is the Trilateral Commission, which was, established with Rockefeller money back in the early 70s. Originally just capitalists from Europe, U.S., and Japan. Now it covers 40 nations. And it's the top 400, capitalists in the world who aren't in government. So their policy positions that they take and their directions provide great influence and understanding to those people that are in government, those people in the intelligence agencies, not just in the U.S., but worldwide. This is the direction we're going. This is what needs to happen. So the influence is quite strong, and in many cases, just direct instructions.
Direct instructions. Right. So, move. That's worrying for people who care about, the values we're supposed to hold dear. So, I believe at the beginning of the book, you suggested that one person could end up holding half of the world's wealth with the concentration that we are seeing. But so in the Oxfam 2017 report, 8 people had half the world's wealth. But by 2019, the Oxfam report that was released in January of that year, 26 people had half the world's wealth. So there's a slight deconcentration still between about the amount of people you could fit on a bus. But how would you sort of explain that kind of deconcentration, however minor?
I don't think I would call it deconcentration. It got spread around the top a little bit, but really we're talking about a crisis of humanity where 80% of the people in the world live on less than $10 a day. Half the people in the world live on less than $3 a day. And a good, a quarter of the people are like $1.50, $2 a day. So that mass inequality has huge costs. And it's the cost in life is like 30,000 people a day dying from malnutrition. There's plenty of food to feed everybody in the world. It's just that a third of the food in the world is wasted or thrown away. And it's just not profitable to sell it to people because they don't have any money to buy it. So we'll let them die. That's a huge humanitarian crisis, a problem. let alone the continued investment where there's good returns in the oil industry and the CO2 releasing businesses. It's like 100 businesses are releasing 70% of the CO2 in the world. And they're all heavily invested in by the giant investment companies. So they are the financial engine to our environmental crisis, to our humanitarian crisis, and to war, permanent war in the world.
Yeah, so it's just been moved about a little bit. Everything is still, of course, within this same structure of obscene, grotesque inequality. So in your book, you later identify how the corporate media and the role that plays within maintaining this system. And you say that, which I found quite astonishing. I knew that there was a big problem, but between 60 and 80% of broadcast and print news content comes from PR and propaganda firms. So firstly, just out of interest, how did you acquire those statistics? How did you find that data?
Well, it's cited in the book. You'd have to look it up. It's right there. I don't have it on the top of my head.
Okay, sure.
Ben Bagdikian was the first person to tell me that almost 25 years ago when he said he was the Washington Post. He said 2/3 of the stories they were getting were really kind of prepackaged PR stories from government and corporations and the PR people that work there or PR firms that were working for them. Mm-hmm. That was the first I saw, but then there have been some studies that validate those numbers, and highest 80%. So major portion of what we're seeing in the corporate media worldwide is that is played as news is really news stories in support of global capital. There's never, just nothing negative about capitalism is reported in news in terms of the consequences in that. Occasional stories about, how we need to be fearful and how the government's going to protect us. That's a big agenda. And then to get us to buy stuff, to sell us stuff. So that's the agenda of corporate media, is to keep us dumb and shopping. It's pretty deliberate. And the corporate media, of course, has consolidated massively, as has capital, in the last couple decades, going from 50 companies down to about 6 major ones. And that's and the young people, they hardly don't read newspapers at all anymore. So their news is on the internet, which is totally controlled by corporate, and the news sites, and from television. So it's a propaganda machine of mind control for people to not understand how global power elites are dominating their lives and their whole way of being, and our culture,
so
our institutions.
Mind control. So how is that? It's very strong, but that's what it amounts to, it seems. So how far does this news management go? Would you say that it is just, oh, okay, here's this story, here's a story from a corporation here, and they're all kind of isolated PR stories, or you think that there is is it reactive? Is it more conspiratorial? Is there sort of sequencing with it, or is it just kind of, okay, the media are strapped for cash, they are just regurgitating these PR stories because they ideologically agree with it, and the bosses want to support and prop up this system, but it's less like there's some kind of directly, specifically manipulative sequencing in response to how social movements are, or how trends throughout the globe.
Well, certainly in terms of yellow vests or the extinction movements, there's been very little coverage in terms of what that's really about, other than it's disruptive and people are getting arrested and things like that. But I think the case that was most to me recently was how corporate media all over the world, when I say corporate media, big corporate media companies, lined up against Maduro in Venezuela. And the party line was he's a dictator, he's wrecking the economy, he's disrupting and humanitarian problems. People can't get their diabetic medicine, all kinds of really awful lies and stories, none of which was true. Yet it was almost lockstep in terms of corporate media, in terms of what was being presented, and even shutting down, using the internet to shut down the electrical system. It was external. The shutting off of Venezuela analysis the last 2 days was external attack. And so there's a coordinated attack on that government, which was fully democratically elected multiple times by as high as 2/3 of the population. And that's a complete lie. So it seems to me that that's deliberate. And then when you recognizing the head of the assembly there as the president, Udo, you look at which countries have lined up to recognize Udo as the president of Venezuela. And it's the same countries that line up and are part of the global capital concentration of wealth. It's the European, most of the Europeans did. I don't think the Italians did. There were a few others that didn't. Nobody in Africa, hardly. Nobody in Asia. And it was intermixed in South America by those that were dominated by the U.S. and those that weren't. So it was clearly a capital agenda transformation, because they would very much like to not only get in for the oil there, which is a massive amount of very good oil, but all the other minerals and resources that are available in Venezuela, including coltan, which is basically only available elsewhere in the Congo, and also continuing difficulties. They would like to have full access to that and full investment capabilities.
Yeah. So it's a very striking example, Venezuela. But so how far is that, do you think, is coming just from a top-down, following the government line when it comes to the relationship between journalists and their sources and that kind of symbiotic relationship, and it coming from that kind of power structure that we see, described by Noam Chomsky, etc., and how far would PR companies be influencing that Venezuelan kind of agenda?
Well, they're all a piece of it, but the core uniting factor would be BlackRock, J.P. Morgan Chase, UBS, are invested in all of those. And they know fully, if BlackRock's got $50 billion invested in your company, you're fully aware of that. And you're very aware of what the agendas are for protecting global capital. So it is a top-down. And it's a management decisions top-down. Journalists can go along with it, or they can resign, literally. And in many cases come to believe it, but that's the best way. They believe they have drunk the Kool-Aid, so to speak. And it becomes a global systems manipulation difficulty that's challenged basically only by some independent nations who refuse to be part of that, who all are under attack. The Chinese, of course, have their billionaires, some 80 or 90 of them, but those billionaires don't control the Politburo. It's very much politically controlled, and so there's capitalism, but it's not capitalism like we have in the U.S., where corporations dominate the government and basically advisory groups right into the White House, um, and, and that we don't. It's not that strong, and we're seeing the integration. So BlackRock just is now opening offices in Beijing for investments there and trying to get all the licenses so they can open up and do full business there. Russia's separate. The oligarchs in Russia basically work with Putin directly, and they dominate. There's greater inequality in Russia than there is in the U.S., and they dominate that. So he's protecting that wealth concentration there, but it's nowhere near the amount the Chinese have, and has been diminished in many ways by the reduction in oil values and pricing that was deliberate against the Russians. So we continue to try to change and manipulate that, but they happen to be the country that could annihilate us, or the world, because they have the weapon capabilities of doing that. So you can only push them so far. And they've been pushing back. They pushed back in the Crimea. They pushed back in Syria. And they've actually sent troops to Venezuela. So they're standing up to this global power structure of dominant capital with the idea that someone's got to say no somewhere.
Yeah, definitely. Just on what you were saying on BlackRock trying to sort of access China. How much is the Chinese government pushing back against this? Is it?
Well, part of the negotiations on the trade problems has been to allow the U.S. is pushing to allow investment in Chinese corporations above 50%, and they hadn't been able to do that up to the present. The Chinese are willing to go along with that. I think as long as they're still in control and can dominate what's going on, the Politburo and the government can dominate what's going on in China. They're investing worldwide, too, and then huge investments going on in Africa, of which, reported in the social science literature, they're usually more culturally sensitive for investments in areas around the world than U.S. capital or core capital. They're more respectful and allow greater input. And so that's interesting in that. And the Chinese are open that way. But we'll challenge them everywhere. I mean, we have bases all over Africa now. That's what AFRICOM was set up to do. And if we need a base in a certain area, we don't necessarily operate it continuously. We create these lily pad bases we can put troops into any time. And they're operating everywhere in Africa. And the regime change that happened in Libya, getting rid of Gaddafi, that hurt the Chinese a lot. They lost a couple $2 billion of investment capital, and they had thousands of people working there that left the country.
Yeah, you said in your book that there was U.S. Special Forces had 100 missions going on in Africa currently.
We've got people in 140 countries in the world advising their special forces and killing people. We're the global empire. And when I say we, that's not just U.S. military. That's U.S. NATO world. Our NATO is increasingly part of that now in Africa and other missions around the world. In Iraq, in Afghanistan.
Yeah, empire seems to be a very, from a distance it can seem like a perhaps exaggerated word, but I think it's a very, very accurate term to describe what we are seeing here.
It's global, and it's required at NATO that the commander there has to be a U.S. General.
Interesting. Just moving away from NATO and just onto the tech giants. How far are they intertwined with the global capitalist class? And what does this mean for the possibility of internet censorship and kind of the crushing of what could be an antidote to what we were talking about earlier with the corporate media and the PR firms and the power structures that are there, how far can this intertwined relationship censor and, try and crush what the possibilities the internet brings?
Well, we're in an era of surveillance capitalism, and that means that the internet companies, Google, Facebook, are all capturing all of that data that on everybody possible they can in the world. And they use it for marketing purposes, and they use it for political purposes and access by the intelligence agencies that want to see what's going on. So that's a major problem, and the big giants are all invested in. That's one of the biggest places they're invested. That's why Bezos got so rich. I mean, BlackRock has got the 17 giants had like 50 billion in Amazon and Google. I mean, huge amounts, and that goes up all the time. So, Silicon Valley and the tech giants are major places for continued capital investment and growth that offer, returns that are on the top scale. So they're, massive investment there, and they're fully aware. I mean, Bezos is fully aware that these giants have, 50 billion in his company. And he's partly, maybe that's why there was diversified numbers of rich people, because he and his wife split up, and she took half of it as well. And but I don't think that was completely, but as we see, the numbers sometimes are talk about income versus wealth. I mean, we have to be careful when we look at what somebody's saying. The wealth in the world's divided this way, or the income's divided that way. It can mean different things, and or control of land mass or something like that. I just recently saw that report in England of the people who were controlling most of the land there, the property. And so there's a lot of different ways of looking at it, but I think it's pretty safe to say that global capital elites dominate what money they have, what's being invested in the world, and that's centralizing and controlling all of us in a very big, permanent way. And it's outside of nation-state control. I mean, it's beyond nation-state control. The strongest influence is the U.S., but still, a major part of that wealth is outside of the U.S.
And the U.S. being, such a big, mass of states is kind of, if you were to look at it on that terms, it's kind of many countries in one, So it's not so surprising that so many come from there.
Our own power lead, the Council of Foreign Relations and other policy groups here, which are increasingly globalizing in their overview, but traditionally were about protecting the U.S. and the U.S. government and the U.S. landmass, but have started to look at global issues as well.
Okay, just finally, so we're seeing social movements rise up around the world against this 35 years of increasingly privatization, increasing deregulation, increasing concentration of wealth. How far will this transnational capitalist class kind of push back on that and the organized elements within it? What would be the nature of that pushback? Might we see in the future as things push more and more, and we see these climate movements pushing more and more? And or how far might they be open to compromise or accept this change?
Well, one of the reasons I wrote the book was to identify the people that could, in fact, make change, if enough of them were motivated to do so. And there could be substantial changes instead of trickle down, which doesn't really happen. There could be major resource transformation in the
sure, right?
Yeah. So naming names was deliberate. And it's the structure. I mean, these people in 10 years, a third of them will be gone, or they'll be doing something else, or retired. But the structure stays the same. So if a corporation, and oftentimes it's even more consolidated. So research on the global power elite showed a decline in the size of big corporations in terms of the boards of directors. So that consolidation means that there's fewer people making the decisions over more capital in a very real way. And then, so as social movement activists engage with these people, as in the case of Jamie Dimon, just a few months ago, people were protesting outside of his home to get him to stop investing in private prisons. And they were successful. JP Morgan Chase is withdrawing from private prisons. Now, I wrote, when I saw that happen, I said, okay, private prisons now, global military agendas next. I mean, it's like we have to, power to the people, so to speak. And that's people power, mass numbers of people, whether it's the Extinction Movement or the Yellow Vest Movement or the Bolivarian movements. Occupy scared the hell out of them. The police state in the U.S., they had infiltrated every Occupy group there was. I mean, they were constantly trying to do all their COINTEL type disruptions that they could do. But a mass movement of people dedicated to climate change could very effectively transform this entire system. And that's probably the only thing that will transform it. It won't happen through the electoral process, certainly in the U.S., and without some major transformations and changes here. So a mass movement of 14-year-olds worldwide, non-cooperating until they feel safe that their lives will be able to be continued, could be an amazing movement and very possible. But it could come in many other areas as well. And it's inevitable that it will, because we cannot continue to have humanitarian crises and mass numbers of poor people who are dying and without a prayer, literally, and it could all be fixed quite easily. So resistance will happen. It continues to go on. The Chinese laborers are resisting in China. I mean, it's just, we don't hear about a lot of this, but there is mass resistance to this concentration of wealth and the rich elites. I think we need to make sure that we follow something like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in our values as expressed in terms of social movements. Somebody would write, like on my website, and say, "Oh, we need to kill them all." And I'll say, "No, you can't say that." And that's not true.
They'd only use that against you as well, so it's
against you, and
it's not obviously the way
I
forward.
will react to that kind of thing because it's absolutely the wrong thing to do. Violent resistance. Mm-hmm. Not only we lose badly, which was one of the reasons that Martin Luther King.
That people who want you to, people who want to crush you. That's why Martin Luther King was so effective, right?
Exactly.
He wasn't doing it because he was just some softie. He was doing it because he knew that it was the most effective way to bring about the change.
He lose badly if it became violent. So I mean, he believed that in terms of Gandhi and the position there, it was massively effective.
Just to pick you up on one thing you said. So you think it's unlikely that it would change via the electoral system. So what about if say the election of Bernie Sanders happened? Because there is a big swell of support for him. Say he was elected president. You think that's unlikely, or you think that if he was, it would still be difficult to change this transnational capitalist class?
I think it would probably be, in terms of the electoral process that we have in this country, Bernie would probably be one of the best options, but it wouldn't it's not going to be a revolutionary change at all. Okay. He's still has to be in Washington, D.C. He's going to still have to deal with the military-industrial complex and the capital investments and try to survive. So, we had a coup here in this country back in 1963, where president was removed and his brother was killed and King was killed, and those were all conspiracies. None of those were killed by the lone gunman, so to speak. I mean, and it's all been proven. I mean, it's well established. Even Congress said in '78 that John Kennedy was killed by a conspiracy, and then they didn't want to go any further as to try to determine who it was. But there's a number of good resources and books that clarify that. So,
what books are they?
Huh?
I knew this to be the case, but I haven't. What books were they?
Well, Talbot's book, David Talbot's book on the brothers, Kennedy and Robert. William Pepper's book on King. I mean, the King family won a court a hearing against the government, declaring that they won. A jury ruled that the King was killed by conspiracy, and so they lay it out quite thoroughly.
Yeah. The court found that she was unlawfully killed, which was the strongest terms that they could give.
Sure, there's many others, and I would worry about someone like Bernie Sanders that he was too effective. That those global powers would decide that an accident needed to happen. Certainly know that airplanes fall out of the sky and things happen to people. A lot of suspicion about the Paul Wellstone airplane crash. So, but nonetheless, that's why social movements are much more needed, and you're not depending upon a single individual or small team of individuals to try to take on the juggernaut, so to speak, this giant empire power. Massive numbers of people saying, no, we're not going to allow this. We don't want our world to become uninhabitable. We don't want a nuclear war. We don't want oppression and killing of people, and we don't want people dying from starvation. And we support the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which all nations had signed on to. And if you read those and follow those, you got a very strong moral base of humanitarian values and concerns.
100%. International law as well is brilliant. It's just not followed in any way.
It's not a treaty. It's not law. It's just humanitarian values that all the nations after World War II agreed on, and are still pretty strong, and set for any social movement to utilize as a moral foundation.
Definitely. So what we need at a final note is the mass social movements. We do not need one person because they are at risk. Same with Jeremy Corbyn here in the UK. We need to make sure that the movement is strong and vibrant in itself, and that we all play our role within this, and we stop destroying the planet and save humanity, because it is literally, the stakes are this high.
You're right. Yeah.
So thank you so much, Peter. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you.
It was good. There's a letter in the back of the book to the global elite, signed by 90 of my friends and associates. We're basically saying that you guys have to fix this, but we're going to pressure you, and social unrest will happen unless you make adjustments and changes, and be thinking of your grandchildren and their grandchildren.
Definitely. Right. Hopefully they listen. If not, we're coming for them.
Divide them up.